Okay, well, I'm here today with James Waters. We're doing an episode of Coffee with Bruce.
I have my coffee.
Excellent. It's pretty late in the day for you there, right?
Yeah, California. It's a nice sunny afternoon here.
Yeah, all right. So James Waters is pretty well known in the industry. He's currently the CTO for the Modern Application Platform business unit at VMware, but he's had a long association with Pivotal, and at least in my mind, James's name is almost synonymous with application modernization. So that's the topic we want to talk about today. And James, I thought maybe I'll just ask you for starters, tell us a little bit about the history. You had a long time at Pivotal, driving Cloud Foundry and things like that. What can you tell us about that, the early days, and kind of how that changed the way people build applications?
Yeah, Bruce, pardon my nostalgia, but I might actually go the whole way back to 2011 when we were
Yeah.
first sketching out some of this. And if you remember, Pivotal was seeded with mostly VMware technology. So we had, some new practices that we introduced, but a lot of the technology bones came from VMware. And so I was in Building E in VMware, uh, and I was talking to the essentially principal engineer at the time on the project. And we both kind of had this moment, but he turned to me and said, if we could just get enterprises to run all of their apps in this more manifest driven or completely automated way, boy, that would just be a revolution in terms of their efficiencies. And he compared it to kind of like the light bulb transition of going from the fluorescent to the kind of LED style of lights. So, like that really, even back in 2011, was the idea that we could bring incredibly higher levels of efficiency and automation to these kind of platforms, but we had to find the right fit of application modernization, practice modernization, and infrastructure modernization. And we didn't have the answers to that all then. We were just sort of guiding towards that destination. But a decade later, it's pretty remarkable to look at some of the organizations we have running at scale now. One of our largest clients is running 170,000 containers with Tanzu today.
Wow.
A pretty big chunk of their estate has really gotten to that model that even back in 2011, VMware had set out to capture.
Wow. So when we talk about application modernization, say, I mean, it's funny you just mentioned sort of massive numbers of containers. Like,
Yeah.
what do you think are like the key properties of modern applications?
Well, I think one of the conversations that came up as part of this journey was this concept of, and I remember when I was first on a call with a banking organization, they started talking about this. I was like, oh, we might be able to get them on this journey. Because in a micro segment of the market, people started talking about this concept called 12 factor. And 12 factor is a pretty interesting thing. It's a blog originally written by Heroku, but the idea was if you were writing software that was destined to be SaaS, which was a very peculiar form of software at the time, like in the early 2010s, SaaS was not everything. There was still a lot of packaged software. But they said you could describe these properties, these 12 factors that would make it more applicable to constant change, to automation, to horizontal scaling, and these properties. And one of these banking architects in that meeting said, I think we ought to start guiding the bank towards being 12 factor.
Wow.
And I can actually think back, and that was the moment of hope for me. I thought, if we could really just start helping the world understand that if the app comes a little bit towards the infrastructure and the infrastructure gets more modern in terms of how it schedules itself, it's sort of this magical 1 and 1 equals 100
Right.
model.
Yeah.
And that, the punchline for this is that we had a client, I was in with them in Seattle, a mobile carrier in Seattle. And over dinner, the client said to me, James, by going to this, more modern application model and modern infrastructure model, we are now running our core application used to take 500 people trying to keep it alive and up to date. We now operate it with 9 people. So that was one of these highlights along the way where you realize if you can align the design of applications, the modernization of applications, and kind of take this declarative container cloud native approach to infrastructure, you really can dramatically change the operating model. And so it's neither just about apps or just about infrastructure or just about ops. It's sort of like this magic puzzle where they all come together. I don't know if that answered your question, Bruce, but these are these are memorable moments for me along the way because we didn't know early on when we started what this could mean for certain organizations.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you've touched on a lot of things there. I mean, one word that jumped out there was declarative. I think, I've spent a lot of time in the last couple of years looking at the rise of Kubernetes. And I think, one of the things which, people often talk about why Kubernetes has been so transformative is because of the fact that you can have this kind of declarative approach to, you don't say exactly how to spin up all those containers. You just say there should be 10 of them, or the overall structure of the application should look like this, and you just declare what you want it to be, and then Kubernetes kind of makes that happen. So this declarative approach, I think we see it running through a lot of things. I guess I did want to ask you, like, Kubernetes is one of those things that's kind of happened in parallel to your journey, and now I think you're intersecting with it in the Tanzu team. How do you see Kubernetes playing into this modern application world?
Yeah, so Martin Casado over at Andreessen Horowitz has a really brilliant podcast. I think you might have some familiarity with these folks.
Got the NSX
Uh,
shirt on here, so.
yeah, you have the NSX shirt on, so I feel like I'm allowed to name drop Martin here. A friend of mine, and he has this really nice podcast on the history of the internet, and he debated kind of how things layer over time. And he said usually what happens in these new technology markets is first there's an end-to-end solution. An end-to-end solution will come out that just tries to get the job done. And then they say over time, what happens is you have these horizontal layers as demand in the market generalizes, you start to see this. And I think you can see that with the mainframe market that transitioned to x86 and VMware, right? Like this isn't, the first time this has happened. And I think in this modern application, modern infrastructure space, that's exactly what happened. Like in some ways, VMware's original Cloud Foundry project was a solution that delivered a modern application platform. But then Kubernetes came along and really generalized that at the container level for all infrastructure.
Hmm.
And I think it's the same kind of transition, like, mainframe, and then you have generalization of layers. The internet, starts off as a complete solution, then TCP came in and nicely layered everything. And so I think that Kubernetes is a wonderful thing because it said, it shouldn't really just be these 12 factor applications, back to where we started, that get declarative automation. And in some ways, Kubernetes was much more ambitious. It said declarative automation should be for almost anything that you can run in a normal, system. You should be able to run in a declarative form factor. And we're going to build all of the hooks in terms of like timeouts, retries, health checks, all the customization you need around networking into the Kubernetes API to really make the world declarative. And that's where I get really excited about the current agenda at VMware because you think, okay, now we're going to bake that ambitious declarative API that brings these tremendous results right into the core of vSphere. Having, 80 million virtual machines in the wild that we're going to bring this declarative automation to, I think that's a really big change. So, anyway, Bruce, that's where I think Kubernetes has been a really strong generalization and a bigger ambition in terms of what declarative could do.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, I think it's really telling. You talk about it getting baked into vSphere. I think one of the things I find very compelling about that is the way that traditionally vSphere is something that operations people had their hands on, but it was pretty far removed from where application people lived. And now we're sort of seeing, well, it's going to have declarative APIs on it that make sense to developers. So this opportunity to sort of bridge the gap between application teams and infrastructure teams, I think that's an amazing opportunity.
Yeah, and the way Joe really describes it, I think elegantly, so I'm going to repeat him, is it's a world where you go from software inventory where there might have been like a configuration system that was essentially an offline configuration system. Like, here's what I think the world looks like out there in production. And then a declarative manifest is really an online configuration system. Like at any point, that controller reconciler pattern is going to say, oh, if the manifest doesn't exist in prod, well, we're going to make sure that it does. And I think that move from sort of a best estimate inventory to an actual, runtime inventory of everything that's happening is a huge transition. And I think it should make it easier for the infrastructure teams to deal with the application teams because they have one stated declarative manifest that says, here's what I want to be running in infrastructure in the state I want it to be in.
Yeah, I think it's a very very powerful shift, and yeah, hopefully we'll see that really continue to gain momentum. Hey, so look, before we finish up here, I thought there's got to be like one or two fun stories you can tell about all the different customers you've worked with over the years. Any sort of interesting customer stories that stand out for entertainment value?
I I think my favorite things along this journey are usually the, oh, that could never happen, and then we made it happen. if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think, when you talk about application modernization, I talk about this term of one factor applications.
Hmm.
And it's like, well, why is James so spun up about one factor applications? And that one factor is sort of like the minimum bar, like it's the opposite of 12 factor. 12 factor being completely optimized for SaaS. One factor that I have is like, could it at least be, restarted and come back up, predictably,
Yeah.
right? So I view that as like this minimum bar of getting something into declarative production in a way that you're going to enjoy it. Like you
Yeah.
might be able to get into production otherwise, but I think predictable restart is a really nice thing to have in your application portfolio if you start to go to this declarative model.
Yeah, I mean, I really like that point. To me, it's a good idea to walk before you run, and I think that's kind of exactly it. It's like, yeah, 12 factors would be great, but if you can maybe get one of them done first, that's a good place to start. And
Well, and the customer story behind that is, I remember early on in this journey, we started applying rolling operating system updates. And this was magic because normally you had to find a patch window, right? Like you've probably seen this. Like, okay, on Sunday night, we close for 3 hours to do these patches, and we're very hopeful that all the apps come back up when we're done. And we just have to, and then if it's a security problem, we have to probably wait till that night unless it's a real emergency. Now, here's the magic of one factor apps, though, is if they reliably restart, you can start to see organizations that we work with aggressively repatching.
yeah,
And so you start to say that the infrastructure team can apply a rolling update patch to the container infrastructure, maybe not anytime, but it's certainly not as surgical as these 3 hour downtime windows on the weekend. And so some of my favorite customer stories are customers, they're like, oh, well, we could never do that level of automation because our apps would never tolerate restart.
yeah,
But once they started to see the return on investment, both in terms of security, operating, downtime, availability, there's been top-down mandates from CIOs to basically get to one factor at least to get all these operating benefits. And I think it's a special thing when you watch an organization go from that could never be uh, to sort of like we just watched a private company land people from space, this
yeah,
week, right? Like now it is.
yeah. Yeah, that's fantastic. And I love the point that you actually get better security by modernizing your apps too. I think that's something that so often gets lost in the discussion, that you can actually be more agile, and that means you can get better security. I think people often view those as completely decoupled, but to me, it's like, yeah, all of these things are not just about getting new features to market. It's also, if you can get security patches done more reliably without having to wait for that maintenance window, it's a huge win.
I couldn't agree more. And if I was in a CIO's seat, I would really try to get as much of my estate to one factor, if nothing else than for security.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times you have all these heavy duty planning meetings because you're afraid to touch any part of your app to update it. And I think moving to that declarative one factor model, security alone is a big benefit.
Yeah. Well, look, we've had a great chat here. I don't want to keep you any longer, but people can find lots of things about you online to go and read some of your blogs and listen to other podcasts with you. So thanks very much for the time, and I look forward to catching up with you in person before too long.
That was great to catch up, Bruce. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Bye for now. Perfect.